So we're already at the fourth lecture in this 6-session class. And here we are still at the beginning of Impressionism. So, well, that's just the way it is. Today, I want to actually cover the one person who was not in the Impressionist exhibition, who was so instrumental in all the early formation of it, and that was the artist Frederick Bazille. And then we will do more with Monet, moving his career along. So at the end last time, you were looking at this and by Monet and this by Renoir, the two fellows spending their days at a favorite, just slightly outside of Paris, leisure spot for boating and socializing and eating and swimming. And it was their foray into looking at not just the world in sun as it appears at any moment, but how people as part of the world also appear. And both men are working very much with this new kind of brushstroke, which is just a sort of a straight line, usually a single color, maybe another color laid on top of it, and strokes that look as if they were laid side by side rather than superimposed in the traditional academic fashion. Because if they're superimposed, that does tell anyone familiar with working in oil paint that this is something that has been done over a long period of time, because any underlayers of color you have to allow to dry, unless, say, it's black. That'll obscure anything underneath that. But otherwise, the colors will get muddy. And what of all things they want is sparkling, bright color, which was one of the things for which people found these paintings very difficult to look at. And I didn't say before, but I thought maybe I better now. It's not only that they were using colors so pure, so undiluted right from their paint tubes, but then they didn't do the final finishing, which was considered de rigueur, which in the academy, which was to put a layer of varnish over it all, so that there would be a sort of an overlying tonality that smoothed out the transitions. And here instead, this glories in this sudden abrupt changes. And that's another way of enhancing the sense of this being done purely spontaneously at the moment. Only now, when the light is coming through the branches in a certain way, would this part of her skirt be lit? What if the dog got up? You'd have to do another painting. So that's just that quality of instantaneity, which is generally it's a ruse. I mean, it's not true, but that's what they're seeking to express, that sense that in life now you don't have time to take things in. You have to just grab it on the go really fast. So Frederick Bazille, you've seen work by him, and you've certainly heard me talking about him. I want to look just at his quite small output, because he worked for less than 10 years before his death. And this was a portrait of him by Renoir. Bazille was an extraordinarily tall fellow. He came from a very distinguished background in the south of France. His parents were Protestants, a very elite Protestant class, and they had their wealth from vineyards. Well, so we assumed that Frederick, when he came of age, would take over the family business. His he showed an interest in art from quite early on. He'd seen an exhibition of works by Delacroix, and that just fired him up, that he wanted to do something like that. His father actually encouraged him to go on in art, but only thinking of that as being a sort of a side passion. And he insisted that Frederick go to medical school. And so he did. He came to Paris in 1862, and he went to medical school. And then on his own, on the side, he enrolled in that same inexpensive school by an academician, the same place where, at that time, Sisley, Monet, and Renoir were students. And they all left at the same time, which was shortly before the studio had to close down. But they formed a really tight bond, and they are this heeding the call of Baudelaire and all this to work in the new modern way. This is Monet's one very quick sketch he did of Basile. And here a photograph. It's a very sad story. So the Prussians attack, so that's the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War. And Basile, without notifying anybody, enlisted in a light infantry unit. See, now Degas and Monet will also serve, but I think it was almost like a responsibility of their social class to do this. But they served more like desk jobs rather than Basile, who was actually killed in the first time he saw battle. He was in a unit, and the officer was badly wounded, so then Basile led, and he was shot twice and died right on the battlefield. So who's to know? He hardly had time to start a career, to know what the trajectory he even dreamed of having was. But what he does is quite distinctly different from what Monet and Renoir did, but it is with their encouragement, his money, that they were partly able to go the way they did. So we'll look at what we have by him. He and Monet were especially close. I mean, there were some people thought Monet was maybe milking him for his money, but that seems probably not to have been true. Anyway, Monet got him very interested in getting out of this studio, painting outdoors, painting the real world. So they went to Fontainebleau. Monet was scouting good locations for that painting of the Déjeuner sous l'herbe, which I'll show you a sketch of that again later. And just learning how to paint quickly in the out of doors. So he and Basile did it together, and by some accident, there's a wonderful story about it, but who knows if it's true, Monet injured his leg, as you can see here. He had a wound. And so he was bedbound for a while, and Basile essentially tended to him. Basile, by the way, failed his medical school exam, so then he was able to spend all his time in his painting. But so he created this improvised drip to cool the wounded leg. It's a very realist work, and in many ways, you would always class Basile as a realist, but this is extremely candid. I mean, you even see the chamber pot under here in this kind of a fusty Victorian interior, while impatient Monet waits to get out again. So they were looking for settings such as what Monet provides here. And that interest the two men have absolutely in common. And this is what Basile is known for, is showing figures in the out of doors. Critics at the time thought that, and subsequently, that's always been his. When he had any attention brought to his work, that's what's brought. So this, to ignore the words when I say the alamy in here, that's just a commercial source of it, but their images are always ones of just very fine and accurate color. So that's why I bring them in. So this is a painting he did sort of early, about 1864. It's almost 5 feet high, and it's just called The Pink Dress. Here's a less distracting image, just not as good color. He had his cousin pose for him near their family estate in the south of France. And she's looking over the village. It's meant to be a very casual scene. You can see even she just has her stockinged feet. She doesn't have her shoes on in an ordinary, everyday apron. I mean, she of course would not be using it because she's is grimy, but that's just part of at-home costume. And then she's seated on this pyramid, and there's this kind of a screed of trees here, separating her from the landscape. Now, her pose is a very traditional academic pose, this kind of 3/4 pose. And he's done something very prudent, which is to show her in what's called a lost profile. So he doesn't have to grapple with doing a portrait face, and doesn't have that face to distract us from looking at this absolutely sun-drenched landscape of the sort that is going to, of course, draw Cézanne back to the south, or later on, Picasso. But you can see, even though she's in shade, from the way there's just a soft light along the arm here, a little bit reflected under there, and then the light hitting the back of her neck. This is not a model who's posing in the studio, that he is looking at her out of doors. He then did take this back to the studio and finish it, but as does Monet with many of his works. And he'd been up to the Normandy coast, staying with Monet. So remember, Monet is this one, the Terrace at Saint-Adresse from 1867, which is in the Met. Well, Basile did something quite similar later on. I think it's that same year, but when he went back down for his summer vacation at his family home. So he's now in the south of France with a very different quality of light. It's along the Riviera. And this is a town called Aigues-Mortes. This is a bigger painting. I think it's almost 4 feet across. But just, has the same interests. The water reflecting the sky, the changing sky, and all objects seen in the light. But he uses very different long strokes and quite sharp edges. This is really wonderfully done right through here. With Monet's, you always can look at what he's representing, and then you can also see the way he's painting it. You see the stroke by stroke by stroke. And here you don't. This much more feeds you into the illusion of the light from that corner tower on the water. And this is the work probably nowadays for which he's best known. And it's just called The Family Reunion. It's 5 by 7 feet. And it was accepted in the Paris Salon in 1868. So he'd made some sketches in Paris, but then when he went home, he took I don't think he took the canvas, but he took the sketches with him And then he worked almost all the painting outdoors on the terrace of his family home under this great big chestnut tree. It's a commemoration of his father's birthday, his father looking extremely stern and very formal, and that, well, people, how do we know? Was that an expression of his character? Was that the deportment thought that was appropriate for people of his sort? Or there's another possibility, especially when you include everyone else who's looking so fixedly out toward us, all except him. Is this simulating Victorian photography, where people have to sit very quietly in some fairly comfortable pose? And in Victorian photographs, they are so very often full front or almost full frontal views. That would be another way in which was made, another aspect of modernity that he's presenting. Because there's none of that, oh, this is good. You see it and it's gone. I mean, this is a formal scene. At the end, he did most of this, as I say, on the terrace. Here he is himself. He later put himself in here. And he looks extremely uncomfortable there, doesn't he? It's where Monet put himself at the edge, and where Renaissance artists often put themselves at the edge of something they did as well, like Botticelli's well known for doing that. So I can show you a few details, and then see there's that village in the distance, in that wonderful light of the southern France. Well, he did that, and then when he came back, bringing this back to Paris, he added this little still life. Actually, at first, he'd put a couple puppies there, and then he changed it to flowers, a hat, and an umbrella. But anyway, it doesn't even look good there. Here, a closer one. It's just totally frozen, which does make it like the photographs. So this will be only a little light hitting, coming at it from the side. Under the tree. Only some light coming through the branches.
Are the two girls twins?
No, these are all just members of his family. So that there's probably a family likeness.
No, there are two girls with the exact same dress on, the one sitting and the one in the back. And they look alike.
Wait a minute. Yeah, we'll get to her in a moment. Just these sprigged dresses. I have Bert Marceau shows figures with this kind of dress too, so it must have been very fashionable. But you know, they could have had the dressmaker use the same fabric for the two of them. I don't know if they're twins. I never read it just mention that they were, but I don't know enough to know. See, there's that blue that Monet loved in particular. As good Victorian women, they will probably do some needlework later on. Oh, let's see. Does the other one have those same kind of cuffs? Can we tell? Yeah, same dress, absolutely. Her face looks very strange, as does this face, right? Those he also changed at the end. He wasn't satisfied with them before. But to me, that looks exceptionally like a mask. Just separates out from the rest. So as I say, that was accepted by the Salon. And the same year, Monet submitted this, his Women in the Garden. And this was rejected. When Basile wrote home about her, he says, yeah, he was accepted. He thought the judges just made a mistake. And he will also later on then buy this painting from Monet. So there's a kind of a self-effacing quality that's very remarkable. And more remarkable and not talked about because I don't know what to say, is that he tackles something that the other artists wouldn't, and it's a shame that we don't have more of, and that he was also showing nude males and putting them in the out of doors, whereas the truism is almost all these modern art movements are built on the bodies of women. So he does this one. It's called A Fisherman with a Net, and the landscape is also from his parents' domain, right along the river that ran by their place. I think they can even recognize that these are the appropriate trees. Now, this fellow was also very clearly outlined, and in that way, distinctly different from what Monet or Renoir would do. He looks a lot as if he were a figure study of the kind that they did when they were studying at the academy, or when they were studying from Greek sculpture. When you see the light on this man who's taking off his socks, that more looks as if that could be taken from the life, as could this, as certainly could the head. This is at the Fog at Harvard, and this one is just called The Bathers, or the Summer Scene. It's done the year before he died, 1869, 70, and it's almost 5 feet square. It's a quite an unusual format for a picture. So he's taking on a bathing scene, just the way Monet and Renoir did, but now he's far more a figure painter. And this was appreciated. This is appreciated. It was an 1870 Salon, and one critic says the sunlight just inundates his canvas. The positions of the men, some scholars done this, that several of these are taken from Italian Renaissance art. Well, that would have Basile working in the way Monet did, which was sort of updating and utilizing the most esteemed art of the past, and then reinterpreting it and bringing it into the present. But he certainly does by giving them all the most up-to-date bathing trunks. And you see how this is a place where it especially strikes me, the bright light hitting just right here, and then not on the upper body. And two men wrestling in the bright light. It's a very formal composition. Look at the way those trees go back on either side like a great big wedge into space. Whereas this is to be, so that looks fixed and posed, yet here's a figure clambering out in the most uncomfortable position. Or this young fellow here, I think Basile tries to do something he just couldn't quite manage, to show a figure moving back that way in the water. So there's a paradox. They look as if they were in the light of real life in a landscape that, again, is a recognizable landscape, but they don't seem to be part of the landscape. It would be nice to know, had he a long career, the way it would have gone. Just 2-3 years later, Cézanne, who's working with this group, begins his well, then lifelong concern about showing female bathers in the out of doors in a sunny day. And this is one of Cézanne's very first ones. So these two people are working with the same theme, and in many ways the same interest in the figure in the out of doors. What a difference in execution. Then you've seen this how many times now? He did also just shortly before he died. And this was in the salon. But there's his fisherman with the net. And, well, I'm not going to show you the painting that is recognizable. It's on the easel there. And then I think I will finish with this half-finished, no, I have two paintings to do, that you see there, half-finished painting. First, this is one that you might see reproduced in many sources now, because especially in the current climate, there's been a renewed interest in saying, well, where were the Blacks in 19th century art, and how were they treated, and how were they viewed? So this is what one of two that Basile did of this same woman who was a model, with a basket of flowers. And you see it's very, very prominent here, his signature and the date in this. She seems to be a flower seller. And he had done several flower paintings. Flower paintings are very popular now. And it's quite likely that this also was a kind of an offering and a tribute to Manet. Remember this figure, the Black maid with a great bouquet from Olympia? So he does something of the sort. And Manet loved peonies, had grown in his garden, did many, many paintings of them. So that may be a kind of an homage to Manet, who is still alive, but it's shows respect for him. And this one that was unfinished in his studio is just called the Toilette. And this is fittingly, I guess, an homage to the person who most inspired him to become a painter, which was Delacroix, from the earlier part of the century. But that interest in Orientalism was ongoing. Now, so this is the same model as in the last one. It shows many different textures, trying to make this. This is probably Renoir's wife, or will be a wife, right there, as a model. He had to write home and say, I need more money because I have 3 models for this work. He couldn't afford it on his allowance. Let's go back. But it doesn't have any of the sensuousness of this, does it? So if he had gone on, whatever he introduced into Impressionism might have helped it move in slightly different ways than it did. But that's it for him. And we're back to Monet. Here we are back in London with his painting, since he's one of those who fled during the war. He's reveling in the foggy days and the absolutely modern construction, even showing construction in progress here. See, the new buildings all around him. So late fall 1871, at the cessation of the war, he came back he'd spent a couple of months in Holland, and then he and Camille and Jean came back to France, and Monet helped them find a place to live, which was at Argenteuil, right here. Pissarro will live right up here. The Impressionist artists almost all lived in the suburbs around the city. You can just scarcely make it out here, but a little bit. You see that Argenteuil is right on the Seine, right there. It's only about less than 5 miles, or maybe a little more than 5 miles from Paris. And Monet lived there for 6 years, and while there, Renoir came to stay with him, Degas visited him, Pissarro came to stay with him, Cézanne visited him. Now, the women would not be able to, because that would be socially inappropriate. But all the men came and stayed and worked side by side with him. Here, what you have is a painting of Renoir showing Monet painting in the garden of the property that he rented out. And Renoir shows that this is a completely suburban area. Argenteuil was growing massively during this time, not only because it was easy to get to Paris, but being on the Seine, and the Seine is very deep right there. There could be a lot of commercial boat traffic. So it was a great transportation hub. And there were several major factories there, one for iron ore, of all things. And it had before that been a major agricultural hub. So Monet is moving into the most modern, most rapidly changing area with all these houses. Now, here's Monet's version. These are about 1872, 1873. So this is Monet's garden. He conceals all but one house, and that's the house, I believe, right over here. We can't work out how the garden fits that way, but anyway. And it seems to be the late or the early fall, and these are dahlias. And they totally dominate the painting. And they also look like, as do their leaves, something so much on the surface of the picture that they are close to us, but also we sort of, it's possible to separate out the vision from the feathery or softer, more distant parts. Again, as if you're looking at a part of the canvas rather than a part of the landscape. And then he did painting after painting of almost all aspects of life around there. The names are, as I said before, the names are not names devised by Monet in most cases. So they're just attempts to try to distinguish on the page one painting from another. This is just called Argenteuil. and it's around 1872, and this is in the National Gallery in Washington. It's a fairly typical size. They're not all the same size. He's not from some paid color man getting, a dozen canvases of the same size and then working with him. There are some differences, but they're about, from 1.5 to 2.5 to 2.5 to 3 feet in size. So this is a Sunday afternoon, and you're looking at the world as he sees it with the light streaming through. The people are just part of the landscape here, very subordinate. And it is what he sees. There's a factory and a spire of a church. So there's no, as one critic will say, these artists seem not to, they want to show things just as they are. They don't arrange them. There's no judgment about them. Yes, it's just what the eyes see. This rather fine estate here. And the water so glassy smooth. So now he's turned around, set the easel up, looking in the opposite direction to the more industrial areas of town. And this is a much busier scene. Even the sky is busier. So people who seem to have been ferried across the water, and then there's one of the several bridges in town. These are probably laundry establishments down here. People sitting or picnicking on the bank, walking along. Again, the light dappled on the trees, and then the light and shadow of their row as they go back. And so much of the whole space is sky. So he balances the busyness here with the grandeur of what's up here. This, I think, is in the Washington National Gallery. The great collection works there. No, this one's in Philadelphia. And it's I'll mix up one or the other after a while, so I better keep my mouth shut. So he's standing, he's just propped on this sloping bank, and you see there has to be another craft right down here moored at the edge that you see not at all. And then this is the passing pedestrian bridge, people standing here, just admiring. There were all sorts of races along here, and as well as commercial work. And it looks totally casual. Not necessarily so, but then you see the light reflected on the piers here. This is the one in Philadelphia. It's a railroad bridge, which had been built only 10 years before. So again, he's showing not only modernity, but something that was extremely modern and significant to the growth of this town, because it's bringing in people from Paris and it's bringing goods in. And before this time, this is just a factoid, the railroad had run along the side of the Seine where we are, and there'd never been a connection. They had to ferry things across. And so this was a great boon to the town, to its growth and to industry, to have this new bridge. And so now he can play with the puffs of smoke as opposed to the colors in the sky. And the light being reflected up onto the girders here, as well as their reflection down into the water. And this is one in a private collection, but since the paintings are of a certain place at a certain time, he could come back in theory day after day and do the same bridge because it will always look different. He could stand in a slightly different place, or here the sky could be different, but you see another one. So that's sort of industry. This is more leisure, two men just watching the scene. Completely different tonality from, because the light is different. And this must have been so interesting to do, to contrast the puffs of the smoke from the puffs of the cloud, which dissipates around the edges. And here's smoke only gradually begins to dissipate. Much more rapidly done, more like an impression, although this was then a finished painting. Look how much of the canvas still shows here. And that same bridge on a gray day. So of course it's an inexhaustible subject because every day is a different, the conditions of the weather are hopefully different, different especially from today. Little houseboat, and you know where that's going to go. Very soon after he moved there, he bought himself a houseboat. Here it is. So that he can go out on the water and, oh, Arna, I just think this is wonderful. The way he shows the reflection. You don't get to see much sky, but you know what the God, this is definitely looking ahead to the Water Lily series. You see the colors of the sky. Here. Water's very still. You can even see the tree trunks. And Getty's images also generally are good quality color. I don't remember seeing this painting. I think the boat was then a little bit bluer, but this is Monet doing Monet painting in his studio houseboat in 1874 with Camille sitting inside there. And he's painting what he sees. So he could go along and look, there's the industry. In this scene from the life. Well, the only other landscape I wanted to bring in today was this one. I think has to be one of the most frequently reproduced, and it's likely a person who's listening now could have a coffee mug that has this on it. I mean, it's just omnipresent, and it's called Field of Wild Poppies, Poppies. Well, I don't know, some version of that name. And let me see. Do that. I don't know where I put the size for that. Yeah, it's about 1.5 by 2.5 feet, and it's in Paris at Musée d'Orsay. This is what Americans loved. I mean, once they got accustomed to Impressionism, because it reminded them of their times there, and it looks just so serene and so beautiful. Well, of course, to the Monet's contemporaries, that's not necessarily so. We see this maybe Camille and Jean in the field. Very interesting. She has a umbrella, but maybe it's sufficiently overcast that she can not have it over her, or is it windy? We can't tell. And then there's some other mother and child here. There's no narrative that can be understood here. And it looks like just the pleasure of walking through this lovely, lovely field. At the time, one thing that would be upsetting to people is what's at the very center. This is a modern red-tiled dwelling, multi-storied house of the kind that was replacing all the old thatch-roofed houses that people were becoming sentimental about the life of the country. So that was something glaringly modern, right in the middle of the picture, which we perhaps would overlook, even though it's in the center. And here he does the same thing he did with the flowers in his garden, the dahlias. If these are poppies, I hope a lot of you have seen fields of poppies in Europe. They're quite wonderful. But look at the scale difference between the poppies and the people. They're way too big. So there's that kind of disjunction between looking at a scene, going into depth, and something on the canvas. We say, oh, that's so much 20th century art. Very briefly, an interlude for some Daumiers. Daumier was still alive at this time. He didn't die until the later 1870s. But it's this idea of transportation. Well, so you see that Monet is very interested, not necessarily transportation by his houseboat, but the passenger bridge, the railway bridge, repeatedly showing the railway bridge. And that this is what was one of the things that was just totally transforming all of France, that people could now easily travel, goods could travel, that increased the national income once they got over the devastation of the Franco-Prussian War. It's just led to a boom time in France. But it also meant that there was social mobility, and that's one thing that Daumier shows in these new works. These are from the 1850s and 60s. This one is in the Met. I thought you might look at that and say, oh yeah, you know that. It's called a third class carriage, because on trains you, as still now, buy tickets by price and social class. He also did first class carriage. This one is in the Walters collection in Baltimore. They were commissioned by the man whose collection started the Walters, and he was living in Paris at the time to stay away from the Civil War. He favored the Confederacy, and so he just preferred to leave. But you see how he's doing it. So he's studying transportation for the social commentary. Yeah, this are buses. There were now buses, omnibuses in, because they're horse-drawn in Paris. And so he does this one of an omnibus. Now, and the buses were single fare for everybody, so you get a complete cross-section of the sort of people. So there's the reflection of how the transportation is changing social relationships and the people and where they can go. Does that interest Monet? Monet? No, of course not. But he was mightily interested in the Gare Saint-Lazare, which is right here, where this is called the square, the square of Europe. There are major streets named for different countries coming in here. And he had a studio quite close to here. The trains, and this which was the busiest and oldest, I believe, train station in Paris, fascinated a number of Impressionist artists. And one man said, oh, you might call them the school of this train station. Here's the early photograph showing it. And Monet's painting. It's just called the Railway, which is definitely secondary here. The buildings are quite blurry, but you can see the signals down here and part of the station house. And this is the smoke from a train. But he concentrates on this kind of enigmatic relationship of his favorite model and this young girl as she looks toward the station and he looks out. But that's at the same time. And then just slightly later, one of the later Impressionists, Caillebotte. Now you have someone standing up above the steam of one train here and some worker looking down at it. But this is the casualness of life on the Paris streets. And then Monet. He did a dozen. Now, one's missing because I noticed this is the repetition of what's up here. But he did a dozen versions of this in about 4 months in 1877. He got permission from the officials at the station, and he could go out onto the tracks or in the terminal and do whatever he wanted. A few sketches survive. So he sort of roughly worked out ideas. And a couple, it looks like he maybe took a canvas and sort of roughed a little bit in drawing, and then he did the rest of it on site. Well, then he'd come back and finish it. But just, there's, again, some variety in the sizes of them, but they're generally, I think the biggest are about 3 feet by 3.5, and then lower than that. And I think this is the one that would be derived from that drawing. Someone later wrote what he was like when he was doing this, that he sat there and there was so much traffic, foot traffic, trains going by, that he would sit there waiting for the crowds to part so that he could paint. And he'd sit there with his brush in his hand, waiting to get a view, and then he'd do a little paint, and then the view would change, and he would have to wait some more. But I thought for these last 5 minutes, we'd just look at them. See, this one's loading. And I have close-ups of this one. And then even closer, this right here. Look how much canvas you see. This one was studied in great technical detail. That it looks like he would lay in almost the old academic procedure, frankly, is what he did. He'd lay in broad areas of color, like the first impression, and then he would come up and build other colors on top of that with more detail, wet on wet. And then at the end, he'd come back with kind of a dry brush and fill in like this, the details, so that you get a lot of textural difference. I think that's the one most commonly reproduced. This was in the second Impressionist show. Well, no, yeah. One at, I can't remember if it's the third or the second. Anyway, the show in 1877. And I have to read to you what an American art student, son of an art teacher and himself subsequently the head of the National Academy of Design and a major art teacher. He was there studying, and this is what he said. He went to see this exhibition. He said, "I never in my life saw more horrible things. I understand they're mostly all rich, which accounts for so much talk. They do not observe drawing or form, but give you an impression of what they call nature. It's worse than a chamber of horrors. I was there about a quarter of an hour and left with a headache. But I told the man exactly what I thought. One franc entry. I was mad for 2 or 3 days, not only having paid the money, but for the demoralizing effect it must have on many." And that man later on becomes an ardent supporter of Impressionism and working on it himself. But it took about 2 decades. And this is one of the paintings that would have sent him over the top. Here, you see just the sky. So for people accustomed to the standard being an impeccably smooth surface with no recognition of a brushwork, I could see how this might give them a headache. Also, in a nice detail like this, you can see how acute Monet is about color. Look at that little bit of green right there. How many different colors in just that area. And the new Haussmann, Paris, somewhat visible there, obscured by steam over here. This cast iron architecture is also extremely modern for them. Some done outside. I don't know if this one, I think I have in 2 colors. I don't know which. So I'm assuming this is way too dark. But this has that Alamy written all over it again. And the last one I'll show you, this is semaphores. Now, does that look like something out of time, out of its time, not something from the 1870s? Well, next session, we'll look at the more, a different strain of Impressionism. And time is up. If there are any questions again or anything you want me to go back to, please ask now.
There was a question posed in the chat, which I tried to answer in my feebleness. You might
Well,
do a lot better.
Okay, once I see put the chat on, I don't get to see the image anymore. So can you just,
I can
Tell-
tell, yeah, Judy asked, what were the criteria to be accepted in the salon? And
that was a nightmare for artists because the judges never told them. The judges had so many to look at that they couldn't really write comments on them. And sometimes they would allow one painting in and one not by the same artist. It seems it had to be generally a fairly elevating or inspiring or instructive subject. It had to show technical mastery. It had to show knowledge of human anatomy. It was gradually changing. I mean, people are realizing that this was just a totally unwieldy system, but that's the old fogies. That's what they wanted out of it anyway. Thank you. Thank you, Judy.
I have
Anybody?
a question.
Okay.
Would these artists have imagined that in 100 years their paintings would be hanging in museums, or were they just solely painting, expecting them to be purchased by private people? And there probably was no such thing as a contemporary modern art museum in their time.
Oh, there was nothing of the sort. They had so they had Duran Ruel and then one other dealer who would buy up a lot of their work and arrange for private exhibitions of it. If they got his attention, that was good. Others, you just wonder, and several of them just had trouble holding it together to keep life going, especially if they were married. They had to have the conviction, and there were some writers also always on their side. It's not as if everybody was against them, but that was definitely the conviction that they were at truly the avant-garde, that society was sometime going to catch up with them, that they were the youth of the future. And of course, Monet and Renoir lived long enough to see themselves marvelously rewarded and lionized, but yeah, not Basile. Yeah, it take a temperament. I remember someone once saying, this is, and it's easy, I think, to understand. This is not something that could have been achieved by one person. It took a group of people so that they could all support one another. Just like these fellows, when they work side by side and they're critiquing one another's work, so that you have that to encourage you so that you can go another step. Anything else? Okay, next week then.